I'm Rob Trasinski. This is Symposium, where we bring people together to have conversations about the nature of liberalism and a free society. My guest today is Tobias Cremer, and he is a research fellow at Oxford, and he specializes specifically in what you might call authoritarian populism, is the term we're using, and the nature of this sort of new right-wing movements in Europe and America. Thanks for coming on.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Good. So we talk about authoritarian populism, and that's sort of the phrase that's become used for it these days. It's an odd sort of, almost a kind of oxymoron, right? Because authoritarianism is, by its nature, a sort of top-down, dictating down to the people. But at the same time, how can you then be populist? So can we talk a little bit about what the authoritarian populist right-wing movements, what is authoritarian populism? What's it based on? And maybe talk about some of the examples that you've been studying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you say, it sometimes may seem quite counterintuitive in a way. And there's a lot of debate of populists being anti-democratic or pro-democratic, and it's not quite clear. But what I think it quite helps to understand where the tension lies is that populists are not necessarily anti-democratic, but they are anti-liberal democratic. They are, if you think about liberal democracy, there's a bit of a tension between liberalism and democracy, between the protection of individual rights on the one hand, and then the will of the majority on the other. And populists really end up or they perceive themselves as defending this like very, very democratic end at the expense of liberalism. And what is behind that is a bit of an identitarian idea of democracy that dates back to a lot of philosophers like Rousseau. But basically what they think is that you can have a single leader, who represents the populace in its entirety. There's no need. Liberal democracy is the idea that there's the need of different factions and protecting minority ideas and all of that. And populists think, no, actually, there is the possibility of the will of the people being identified in one movement or one personality. And as you mentioned, I've worked on a lot of different state case studies, mainly in Europe and the US. And that is one thing that we see in common in the US, of course, with Trumpism in many ways, but also in Europe. In France, you have the Front National with the Le Pen family. In Italy, you'll have people like Salvini. There's very often this idea that one movement or even one individual can incarnate, in a way, the will of the common people and get rid of this like middling elite in the middle.
Well, that's something I've noticed about it in the U.S. Now, this idea of the single leader who embodies the will of the people. This goes back to Rousseau. It goes back to Hegel, I think. This idea that, there was, I think, Hegel who said the people does not know what it wills, so it needs somebody to come along and interpret and embody the will of the people. But it also, one of the ways I noticed that it happens in the U.S. especially, and I'm sure I know enough to know that this is true in Europe as well, is it does come across too as a railing against the elites. The idea is that there's the common people who have their values and their goals and their interests. And we're really defending the sort of inarticulate common people. They need a defender who can stand up against the elites. Now, in practice, the elites basically means anybody who disagrees with us. I'm broadcasting here from a cellar in Central Virginia. I'm not inside the Beltway. I'm not in New York, but I get called an elite all the time because I'm the guy who's contradicting whatever the party line is supposed to be for the populist movement. But it does tend to be in the rhetoric. It's the idea that really it's the elites who are anti-democratic, the people who are running everything, the meritocracy who's in charge. They're anti-democratic, and we're speaking for the quote unquote real voice of the people.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think you're absolutely right there, Rob. That the idea is that we have built, and the US Constitution is a prime example of that, but like the German Constitution and the British Constitution as well, we have this idea of representation of democracy, and there are different layers. So you vote for your member of Congress, and then that member of Congress represents you towards represents you in Congress, and we have the same thing in Germany. That several layers, etc., etc. And in a way, there is the risk that with every layer of delegation of the will of the people, the number of people actually in charge does decline, and then you end up with a bit of an elite, and there is to an extent the danger that they might do something slightly different. But then on the other hand, we actually did that on purpose. If you look at the founding fathers, if you look at the Federalist Papers, for instance, the idea of a representative is of a representative, not of a delegate. In many ways, that's different. That person is supposed to represent what that person perceives to be the will of the people or the interest of the people, but it's not just a mouth of, it's not just like, here's a letter of what we want you to do and do that. It's not just an instrument. And we give some agency to these actors. And in a way, what now authoritarian populists say is actually, no, we don't want that. We don't want these representatives to have any agency. What we want is a much more direct idea of democracy. But the problem is, that is open to misinterpretation. That is open to somebody saying, I as the only person, I'm cutting out all these middlemen, and I as an individual am the real representative of the people, and that's an abuse to power. And this is why dictators in the whole world since Napoleon have used plebiscites and referenda to really cut out any opposition and say, I'm the real, I incarnate the people like nobody else does.
Yeah, I'm wondering the extent to which this is also a response or a reaction against the sort of heavily regulated and highly bureaucratic and technocratic systems. I mean, the European Union is a great example where, yes, there's a European Parliament, but does anybody in Europe actually feel like they have a say in what comes out of Brussels? I mean, I think this is absolutely what was behind Brexit. This idea that nominally you're represented, but in reality, you feel like these are a bunch of unaccountable bureaucrats many miles distant with completely different agenda than you who are making these decisions. And I think that, going back to Rousseau, as I recall, one of his big arguments was that you need the king or you need the strong man representing the people in order to be a counterbalance against this sort of corrupt and rapacious aristocrats and the middle and the elites and the middlemen and the people who are running the system. You need somebody who's a voice of the people to go against those elites in a far off distant capital. And it was to some extent a reaction against the highly centralized French bureaucratic system that had already been created at that point. So you think that to some extent, maybe Europe is not, and to some extent America has the same dilemma, that maybe we're not democratic enough in the sense that too many layers of bureaucracy have been built up in the center.
I think there's definitely something to it. And in a way, it brings us back. And this is one thing I always discuss with my students, because everybody's in favor of liberalism in the UK and everybody's in favor of democracy. But it's difficult to understand that there is some sort of tension in it. And in a way, we might think that, for instance, the European Union has gone way to the extreme of liberalism, saying, okay, we put all these like rules and regulation and rights, and it's all well-meaning, but it's in a way almost to protect the majority or protect minorities from the majority, or protect individual rights, or protect property rights, or all of these things, all of these legal methods, and kind of take it away from democracy because people do things that you might not agree with, and take it out of the democratic process in some ways. And in many ways, that's a good thing. But we might overbalance. And I think you're definitely right that the European Union has somewhat gone, it's very, very liberal, but in many ways anti-democratic.
Well, I also think that you can't underestimate the extent to which what we have right now is the result of a previous sort of authoritarian populist movement and the progressive movement. 100 to 120 years ago, the progressive movement had a lot of these same sort of ideas that, well, we need a strong leader and we need a bureaucracy. We need bureaucrats to run everything in order to promote and protect the interests of the people. And so they actually they moved a lot of power out of the representative bodies, out of Congress, out of the things that the areas that are more directly answerable to the people, and into a giant federal bureaucracy. Right. So, and this was a very deliberate creation on the part of the progressives of creating this giant federal bureaucracy, and all the really important stuff will be done in the bureaucracy. And it will be done by these, these sort of technocratic administrators who know the real interests of the people. So I wonder if we're paying the price for that, that what is often sort of seen as, oh, this is the problem with liberal democracy, is actually the result of a previous wave of authoritarian populism, sort of the Woodrow Wilson variety.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. And I think in a way, it's also the question whether, in a way, normatively, are we really pushing for democracy? Or are we pushing for meritocracy? I think there's been a fantastic book by Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel recently about the tyranny of merit. That in many ways, we usually tend to think we are both democratic and meritocratic, and the two of them go together. But in a way, there again is a bit of a tension. I think this is what you are getting at, that we are saying, oh, we need these super educated, Harvard educated or Oxford and Cambridge educated, really like good technocrats who know what they're doing, they're specialists, and they should be in charge of doing things. And we get rid of the old aristocracy in some way. But in some ways, we also get rid of like the voice of the people, because they don't know what's best for them. And there is this risk of actually undermining democracy with meritocracy. So yeah, like we actually have this tension in reality between meritocracy and democracy. And the founding fathers in the US, but also the writers of the German Constitution or of the French Constitution, are supportive of both. They say we need both. We need, on the one hand, these like bureaucrats who are educated in elite institutions in Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, at Harvard, Ivy League in the US, and like we have very, very meritocratic institutions in Central Europe as well. And they are supposed to like be really good technocrats. But then you also need to check them with democracy, with the voice of the people, because in the end, the problem is they might be specialists in their field, but so far this like reign of philosopher kings has never quite worked out, and they are still supposed to work for their representatives. So I do think that if we go into one way too much, into the technocracy, you have really strong democratic problems, and philosophers are not, and I say that as a bit of a philosopher myself, are not great kings, and you need to check them, you need to kind of tell them what to do. They are in the end, they're ministers to the people. They are servants to the people, and that's the whole idea. But then on the other hand, if you go into the tyranny of the majority, you end up with something that is more like authoritarian populism, where really you have a tyranny of the majority, and you might actually end up with a lot of rules and policies that really harm democracy itself.
Well, you get the problem with the idea that in order to make the voice of the true people dominant, you end up with oftentimes, if we go to look to Eastern Europe, there are attempts to do this in places like Hungary, of having more and more government getting involved in the media, state-controlled media, and the idea of having the authoritarian leader setting the message. And in the strength of the liberal democracy or liberal republicanism is that it always has mechanisms for giving a voice to the minorities and letting them have a say and have their institutions. And when you say no, the true people are going to speak, and we're going to shut out anybody who's not part of that, that's where you get the point where you're no longer you are nominally being democratic, but you're actually shutting out dissent and becoming undemocratic. But one of the issues though I want to talk about is that when I was getting at the centralized bureaucracy is the extent to which illiberalism in the economic realm, or the idea of a highly regulated state. So when we went from sort of classical 19th century classical liberalism to sort of 20th century, what is sort of standard 20th century liberalism, that's where you got this idea of this, the bureaucracy became enormous and powerful and seeming like it has a role in everybody's life. So what if there's a federal Department of Education, which there wasn't until about 50 years ago, if there's a federal Department of Education that's promulgating rules downward that's going to affect what your kids are being taught in school, that adds to this disaffection of, well, wait a minute, who's running all this? And there are people who are off in Washington who are part of a separate sort of class or group who don't necessarily represent my ideas or values. I saw a great comment during the Brexit. There was that long period in Britain where they had the referendum for Brexit, and then they were trying quote unquote to implement it and not really doing anything. And somebody summed up, from the bureaucrat's perspective, Brexit is the will of the people, but it's not the will of any people who he actually knows. So he's not working very hard at it. And I think that's a real factor. If it's the will of the people, but not the will of anybody you actually know, it's very easy for you as the bureaucrat, as the elite person, to just ignore what it is that the voters voted for.
Yeah, and I think that is definitely a problem. We have that there are loads of really interesting books at the moment on also the tyranny of the technocracy, and I think Europe is particularly strong on that. But I think in some ways, things like the Brexit referendum, or what many right-wing populists put us in front of, is a false dichotomy. They say either you give all the power to these liberal elites who are unaccountable bureaucrats who are there for a lifetime, and they can't, they're just these other people and they don't care about me, they look down on me. Or we have referenda and we have this, we surpass everything. And that is what we saw in the UK. And you kind of cut out what our constitutions put actually in the center of democracy, and that is representative democracy. That is Congress, that is Parliament, that is the Bundestag in Germany, is the Assemblée Nationale, is the idea that they are representatives of the people, who then tell the bureaucrats what to do. And we saw that really strikingly. I mean, I've spent the whole Brexit saga, I was living in the UK. And it was astounding to me how, on the one hand, yes, absolutely, there was this reaction against anti-democratic Brussels, or it was perceived as anti-democratic Brussels, no accountability. But then at the same time, the Brexiteers said, now we've won a referendum. And Parliament actually said, oh no, we want this sort of Brexit or this sort of Brexit. And then the government said, well, we won the referendum. We now say we are the representatives of the people. We don't care what Parliament says. Parliament is undemocratic. The sovereignty of Parliament is taken away. And that was actually quite shocking. And that is the danger of direct democracy. And that is, being German, I don't want to make too many references to German history, but this is exactly what the Nazis did. They said, it's Parliament, like this democracy, representative democracy, that is broken. They don't represent the will of the people. We as the party are much more representative because we have Hitler and we have a referendum and we have plebiscites, and we don't need all of these institutions in the middle. And I think this false dichotomy between, on the one hand, this really direct democracy, and then on the other hand, technocracy is wrong, because we have this middle ground, and we had a lot of really clever people who put this in constitutions and said that's a really good compromise between these two poles, that both of which we need.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that it's the institutions of how you balance the need for some sort of check on the will of the majority, with the fact that you do have to ultimately respond to the consent of the governed. Now, the other area that you've been researching, though, specifically, is the role of religion in authoritarian populism. And I find that fascinating, too, because here in the U.S., we had the astonishing sight of the evangelicals lining up behind, this, thrice married, very decadent sort of New York City. New York City is considered, Sodom and Gomorrah, for most of the time that I can remember. And seriously, here's this guy straight out of New York City, embodying everything that you would think of as they'd be against, and they lined up behind him. So it really creates some interesting questions about how is it that religion and Christianity in particular is being used by these populist movements.
Yeah, no, and I think that's absolutely fascinating, because, and that was what brought me to research that, because that is not just something that's limited to the US. On the one hand, you have this, as you say, this thrice divorced, not particularly pious historically, and by his own admission, personality who starts saying, I'm the real defender of Christian America. But you had the same thing in Europe. You had the leader of the Front National, saying I'm the real defender of Christian or Catholic France, while at the same time saying I'm also the real defender of secularism and making sure that there's no religion whatsoever in the public sphere. You had self-declared atheists like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands or leaders of the AfD in Germany declaring we are the real defenders of Christian heritage here. And it was really quite interesting to have this come together. And so what I tried to do in my research was really talk to these right-wing populists themselves and try to figure out how their idea of Christian identity might be similar or different to what we historically perceived as Christian identity, or what maybe institutions like the churches themselves would define as such. And one really striking finding was that, in fact, what we are witnessing here is not necessarily a return of religiosity to politics, but much rather the rise of, in some ways, a post-Christian right, a right that sees religion really only as an identity marker, for whom religion is in a way dissociated. Religious identity or Christian heritage is in some ways dissociated from Christian practice, beliefs, or institutions. So to say, we defend Christianity as a cultural, sometimes geographical, historical, in some instances even racial concept, like it's the faith of our fathers, it's a tribal faith. And it doesn't really matter whether you go to church, it doesn't really matter whether you believe in God or not. What matters is whether you are part of this cultural identity. In a way, that's a secularization of the concept of religion itself. It's a secularization of Christianity. Christianity really here only as a cultural identifier, a sort of belonging, but not necessarily of belief. And I think it's really trying to understand this dissociation in a way that can help us understand why right-wing populists reference religion, why somebody like a Trump or a Le Pen might reference religion. Now, the other question is then, of course, why many Christians agree with that or like support it. But I'm happy to go into that in more detail. I don't want to.
Well, no, I think we will go into that in a second. But I want to backtrack on that a little bit, which is this idea of, so in America, I know there is, I think specifically that this is not a theological, it's Christian, but it's not theological, and they don't really care about the theology. Now, in America, there's a small group of people, mostly Catholic intellectuals, who will talk about integralism and this idea. They actually have a theology and a worked out theory as to the relationship of church and state, and why I think they have a fantasy that somehow if we have the state coming in to get involved with religion, that it would somehow be favorable to Catholicism, which I think is a really big stretch. But you have some people who are theoretical about it. But I think you're right. A lot more of it is the sort of it's a cultural marker. It's us. It's what differentiates us good people out, us real Americans out in the heartland versus the decadent elite. And I'm really fascinated by this idea of the phrase cultural Christian. Because it basically means I don't believe, but it's a cultural marker.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a German term, Kulturchrist. So we had that already in the.
And of course, it's one word. It's all one word in German, of course.
Everything is one word in German. Yeah, but it's the idea of you are still part of this cultural identity. You are still part of this. Also, it comes back actually to some sort of liberal theology. If you think back to somebody like Hegel, where he says like there's the nation is also an expression of theology, and that you and of creation and of providence, etc., and that you kind of can start like go away from the institutions of the church, go away from the Bible itself, and actually have a much broader idea of providence and creation expressed in the nation, and that you can get rid of all these institutions in between. In a way, and you had that in its extreme in the 1930s, what the Nazis tried to do, and I have a bit of personal history there, because my great-grandfather was a pastor in the 1930s in Germany, and he was in the confessing church in the opposition to the Nazis, so he worked a lot with people like Karl Barth or Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But there was a really big struggle inside the German church between, on the one hand, these people who are saying, oh, let's recreate, they call themselves Deutsche Christen, German Christians. Let's recreate Christianity in the German image. Let's get rid of everything that's Jewish. We don't need this Old Testament. We don't need the Rabbi Paul. We don't need all of these like Jewish parts of it. And we replace in a way the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost with Führer, Volk, and Vaterland, and say this is Germanic Christianity, and it's not about faith; it's about blood. And against that, you then had the Confessing Church, which actually was saying, let's go back to neo-orthodoxy, let's go back to Scripture, and based on that, we can't do all of these things. You can't just throw out the Old Testament. But I think this is a bit the tension we have there. If you take the faith out of religion, it becomes much easier to redefine. And we see it in China at the moment. China is trying to recreate a Chinese Christianity.
Right.
And chances are it's not going to be as tolerant as Christianity usually might be.
Well, usually it is a relative term because there's a whole history to the church. That Christianity has a reputation for relative tolerance in the last 100 years or so. It hasn't always had that.
Oh, no.
But one of the things I wanted to talk about was it's the dilemma of separation of church, the reason for separation of church and state. One of the reasons is that when politics gets involved in religion, sometimes the politics takes over the religion. It's sort of I think in the Byzantine Empire, the system was described as Caesaro-papism, where Caesar becomes the Pope. And, oftentimes a religion will then become merely an instrument for whatever the needs of the state are. And that's really the warning to those who are religious, who say, oh, we want the government to come support us. The warning to them is when government comes in, suddenly then your religion becomes an instrument of politics and gets rewritten to fit certain political goals. And I definitely see that in American evangelical circles that has sort of happened, that they've lost the sense of having a separate identity. But I think it comes as a defensive mechanism from feeling sort of beleaguered there are polls in America showing the last 30 years, basically, that church membership has basically fallen off a cliff. And we've just reached the point where I think fewer than 50% of people have a official church, are regular churchgoers and have an official denominational affiliation. That the largest number of people there are people who are not necessarily atheists, but who are unaffiliated with any particular church. And I think that's causing a certain kind of panic, and they're feeling beleaguered. How is that different from, I want to get a sense of how that's different from the European context, because I know part of what's going on in America is the idea that the Democratic Party has become thoroughly the party of secular elites who are hostile to religion. And the Democratic Party does plenty of things to reinforce that sense. Whereas in Europe, there's a little more of a tradition of the sort of the Christian democracy, where the liberal or left, even the left-wing parties also have a religious component to them. And I think that makes for a somewhat different politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it's you're already spot on there. Like, one of the main things when I talk to faith leaders in the US, why people would support Trump was that they said, like, they initially didn't like him, but they had the sense of, like, the secularists are coming for us. We have to take the smaller evil. And really, like, some sort of it's quite a panic, and I think in many ways it's genuine. I think some of them really are convinced that the secular world is closing down on them. But what I find interesting is, coming from Europe, which is significantly less Christian than America. I think it's if you have 50% of people who might still go to church, I think in Europe it's close to 5%. But at the same time, you don't get the same sense of this persecution complex within European faith communities, and I think, and especially not in, for instance, German faith communities. And I think part of the reason for that is twofold. On the one hand, exactly what you say, we have a tradition of Christian democracy, that like the parties, not just the conservative parties, but also center-left parties, have a very open commitment to faith, and that it's allowed to have that, and to Christian values, and that is allowed to have that through the constitution. In Germany, for instance, we don't have a state church. We have quite a few state churches because the constitution is saying religion is something very positive in civil society, and therefore every faith community has, in theory, the potential to become a state church and have like tax benefits and all of these things be included in policy making context, in an advisory way, very formalized in all of these things. So as a result, it's really hard to create a narrative of we are persecuted because these faith communities, like, I mean, my mother is a Lutheran minister, and she has the status of a civil servant. It's really hard to then like say, oh, the state is in for us, the state is coming after us. And I think that's quite important, this like symbolic inclusion and integration of faith communities on the state level, on the country level, which then makes it really hard for populists to say the state is anti-religious in any way. And even in a place like Europe, you might then have the feeling that you are less persecuted, even though in reality America is still much more Christian, and in reality faith communities in the US probably still have significantly more influence over policy making than they do in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is that sort of mismatch between a sense of persecution and the fact that they actually have enormous amount of influence, especially relative to Europe. I also think in Europe, the sense of persecution gets then channeled into the immigration issue. And I think that you know, we had a discussion briefly before about this odd quirk that America has almost no Muslim immigrants, but that Muslim immigration is somehow still a big issue here, or at least comes up as an issue, even though we have hardly any Muslim immigrants. But in Europe, it is this. Maybe some of that I think may also just be bleed over from the people picking up from the European discussion, because Muslim immigration is a major thing that then can be spun into a narrative of Christians being beleaguered and embattled.
Yeah, and I think there is a bit of in a way it fits into this whole narrative of moving to almost a post-religious sort of politics, because we are moving towards much more of what can be called like a civilizationalism, of the idea that universalist liberal Western values might be coming to its end, might be coming to their end of dominance, and that instead we have what Samuel Huntington once called the clash of civilizations. And it was really striking that when I talked to right-wing populists, both in the US and in Europe, that was probably their favorite book. And they were saying, we have to rally together as Western civilization against the threat of Islam as the main threat to Western civilization. And in Europe, obviously, it's much more acute, just because they are, especially in many of these movements, had real success in 2016 when there was the migration crisis, and this idea of there is even it's called the replacement theory, that liberal elites have allied with Muslim countries to get a lot of Muslims into Europe and replace the white European civilization and population because they didn't like it. I mean, very out there theory, but there are a lot of people in Europe who believe it. So it's like, the one thing they all agree about is that Islam is the threat. And then given this threat of the external other, and this redefinition of the other as Islam, then Christianity can come in as an analogous identifier of Western civilization. But again, we are moving away from actually theological differences towards this civilizational difference. And it's actually quite interesting that when you talk to faith leaders, they are much more positive, Christian faith leaders, both in the US and in Europe, are much more positive towards Islam than right-wing populists, because they actually say like, oh yeah, we might disagree on a lot of things, but in many issues we agree, in many cultural issues we actually agree on family values and all of these things. And you saw that for instance, the Tea Party in the US had a quite strong Muslim component, and you had compassionate conservatism by George W. Bush, who also said, like, these are people of faith and they should be part of the of a conservative coalition. And the US has actually been really good and much better than Europe historically in including Muslims and integrating them in their society. There has been much less Islamophobia in the US than in Europe. However, as you say, it's really weird that over the last 10 years, especially since 2001, since 9/11, but really galvanized by Donald Trump, is that Islam has become this big other in rhetoric, even though compared to Europe, there are like very, very few Muslims, and those who are in the US actually amazingly well integrated.
Yeah, I having been involved in a lot of the discussion, post 9/11 discussion in America, I think that the idea of a clash of civilizations with the Islamic world had a lot of currency, but from the top down, from George W. Bush always made a real point about trying to say this is not a religious war. We're not against Muslims. We're tolerant and reaching out to Muslims and having this message of tolerance of Muslims as a central message from the top of the political leadership. So it was bubbling down below. But I also think, and there were reasons for people to be concerned that in Islam there is a strong intolerant, and the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris and things like that. But I think that the interesting thing is that in the Bush era, it was more sort of outward focused. This is the threat from radical Islam is why we're out there sending troops and going to war. And now Bush combined it with the idea that we're going to spread liberal democracy and universal values to those areas of the world. And after that, the striking thing about the Trump era is there's that sort of paranoia almost about Islam, combined with withdrawal from the world and withdrawal from the war on terrorism, and a very generally non-aggressive or non-active stance about promoting liberal democracy and that sort of thing in the Middle East. And the current withdrawal we're doing from Afghanistan was begun under him. So it's almost like it's withdrawing inward and saying, we're not going to engage with Islam out there, so we need to hunker down and be even more, more concerned about excluding it from here. And I noticed that shift from sort of hawkishness on the war to then sort of anti-immigration sentiment, just saying, well, if we can't fight them over there, we need to keep them over there and wall off our borders and keep any of them from coming here, because that's the real threat.
Yeah, and in a way, it's quite interesting. So that is actually what you describe is exactly a really strong component of this new right-wing populist, and some might say right-wing identity politics, that embraces what is called, the approach is called ethnopluralism. The idea of different but other, of equal but different,
separate but equal, we would say in the US.
Exactly, separate but equal. That you keep different cultural identities apart, that they don't mix well together, is the idea behind that, and that you have every culture has the right to keep its culture specific and pure and all of these things, and then to say, like, they can be Muslim or whatever in their country and they stay there and we don't go and interfere there, but in turn they shouldn't migrate over to our country and change our culture. But what's interesting about that is it's quite relativist. It's quite saying there is no good or better, there are no such things as universal values. We don't really care for universal human rights because well, if you are Chinese and born in China, you have different cultural values, and therefore you might not mind as much to be persecuted by the Chinese government, and you might not have the same undeniable universal rights. And in this way, by saying we defend Western civilization, well, most of us might agree that Western civilization is defined in the last 100, 200 years, is largely defined by this universalist, liberal and historically Christian idea that that's universal. Human rights are universal, and a lot of rights are universal and they're universal norms and values that are worthwhile defending. And in a way, right-wing populists, by trying to defend the West or Western civilization actually say, but this universalism doesn't matter. So they undermine the very idea that's underlying Western civilization over the last 100 years.
Well, I would say it actually goes back much farther. I think universalism is sort of there at the heart of the very beginning of Western civilization in ancient Greece, because the real achievement of Socrates, the first great Greek philosopher, was this idea of saying, well, let's question every idea to see how much of it is just sort of unthinkingly repeated custom or tradition, and how much truth there actually is behind it. So the idea of getting behind everything and questioning it and finding the universal truth that's available to all men behind the, and not just taking tradition or custom or, what was handed down to you. That I think is essential it's central to the distinctive Western intellectual tradition. But what strikes me about the anti-universalism is that, and this sort of, keeping different ethnic groups different, is the strange way in which, and I don't know to the extent, what I really want to know to the extent to which this is different from Europe, which is the extent to which it's almost a mirror image of today's left, or at least the sort of the woke or politically correct left, where they have this obsession with racial politics and the idea that there are, there's white values, and then, there's a huge vogue right now about talking about whiteness and what are white values and white ideas, and racializing values and making them non-universal, and having the idea that different ethnic groups or people from different backgrounds inherently have, because of their background, they inherently have different values. And it strikes me as, the joke here is that, for the sort of woke left, that there are four stages of wokeness. There's woke, there's extremely woke, there's ridiculously woke, and then there's alt-right, which is you go and become a white nationalist. And that's also part of how you get the sort of pincer movement, where, because among the sort of elites at the top level of the culture or the universities or politics, the woke ideology is extremely popular, that you then have the populists saying, therefore we need somebody like Donald Trump because he's not politically correct. He'll fight back against that. So you get the elites go one way and the people go react against that. But at the same time, there's such a parallel between their ideologies. But my impression, because I've been hearing the French president railing against all these American ideas coming in, which I think very funny, because half of these American sort of politically correct American ideas, half of them came from Michel Foucault, a French philosopher. But that there seems to be much less widespread adoption of the sort of the quote unquote woke illiberal version of the left that we have in America, much less of that in Europe.
Yeah, I think that is still true. And first note, I do really think that, like, there's something to what you just said, the relationship between right-wing and left-wing identity politics. And it is really stunning when I talk to leaders in the US and in Germany and France. That was one of the big tenets, was that left-wing identity politics feeds off right-wing identity politics, and right-wing identity politics feeds off left-wing identity politics. That in some ways, this like new right-wing identity politics is a mirror image. It mirrors but reverses the identity politics of the left, also saying, yes, every culture has the right to self-determine itself, and they have group rights to be different, but they say they are defending the group rights of the majority rather than that of minorities. So in a way, trying to reverse that. And I think part of the reason why we might see less of that, of the left-wing identity politics in Europe, is that in Europe, unlike in the US, the economic cleavage, the economic divide is still much stronger. So you still have a bit more class identity. You have a lot of these other identity forms. The crisis, I sometimes feel that the crisis of identity in the US is in some ways stronger because the institutions have been eroded to a larger extent. So if you think about different sources of identity, we all have individual identities, but traditionally we also all had like group identities, like your regional origin, your faith, your social class, your like all of these things. Maybe you're a member of a club, and all of these things. And I think because America is a much more individualist society, a lot of these institutions have become weaker, and especially with secularization. The biggest provider of social capital in America, which are churches, are eroding. And there's a fantastic, Rob Putnam is the specialist on that at Harvard. And I think in Europe, these institutions are to some extent still stronger. And that as a result, this crisis of identity, group identities are not quite as eroded there. And that therefore, there's not that much of a crisis of identity. As a result, identity politics, which capitalize on the feeling like you don't know who you are, you don't know who you belong to. Here is we give you some sort of identity. And in the worst case scenario, it's the color of your skin because you can't change that. And if you don't have other sources of identity, if you don't have other, if you're not integrated in other ways in institutions, well, then that appeals to you. And in Europe, there still are the other sources more, yes.
I'm also wondering if, to their extent, America has never had as much of a focus on class, economic class. I mean, it's always there's been elements of it, but the sense of economic class being a divider between people, it's been much weaker, I think, here.
Yeah.
Because in Europe, it was all left over from aristocracy, where there was the class divide was very much more entrenched and a much greater, going back in America, the idea of the self-made man, that you could come from poverty and you could become wealthy, and it's all just interchangeable, that was much stronger. So I think we didn't have as strong an identity in class. I think the only real class difference we have in America, and maybe this plays into this, the real class difference we have in America tends to be college educated versus non-college educated. And then that feeds into these sort of culture war things, identity wars, because the college educated tend to be much more interested in sort of the latest fads and intellectual fads, the latest ideas coming out of the universities, more influenced by that. Whereas the non-college educated are more connected to whatever the traditional sources of identity are, including religion. I think that's an aspect of it. But one last thing I want to do before we end here is I want to talk about Eastern Europe, because you've been talking about Germany and France. Eastern Europe I find interesting because what effect is Putin having on this? I know there's been giving some funding to right-wing groups in Europe, but I'm also thinking more too in terms of the model he created, the example he created. And I know he's done a lot of work with like reaching out to the the Russian Orthodox Church, and sort of building up the Russian Orthodox Church in this sort of alliance that they've got, where he promises to be the defender of traditional religious values, and they are in turn try to get people to rally behind his regime. And this sense of creating this sort of authoritarian, populist, nationalist new model for how you create a sort of authoritarian regime.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question if you look to Eastern Europe, because it's a slightly different dynamic, especially if you look to Russia, because obviously it's not a democracy. So a lot of these populist tensions that we might have in Europe between democracy and liberalism just aren't that much of a matter. But what I think Putin is really profiting of, and what his policy really incarnates in a way, is this shift from universalism to the clash of civilizations, or this idea behind that, saying like, oh, we have this Russian culture, and you don't have to say, you don't really get to have a say in how that changes. And actually, we are defending Western civilization, and we can redefine what Western civilization is, and all of this. And he's really buying into this civilizational rhetoric. The difference is now no longer ideology of communism, of one universalist ideology against another universalist ideology, but of civilizationism. And it's quite interesting that we mentioned earlier that civilizational Christianity is somewhat detached from faith or theology, and Russia is a prime example of that. I think there has been a massive rise of self-identified Orthodox since the end of the Cold War. I think it's like up to 80%. But the rise of people who say they believe in God is still below 20%, I think, in Russia. And you can really, really see how he is presenting religion as a cultural, secularized identity marker. And in that way, he is creating an example for which many right-wing populists see like, that's a good idea. He doesn't actually have to follow the theology of things, but he can still use it as a rallying source. That is the more abstract way in which he works as a model. I think the more direct ways in which you alluded to in terms of money, I think is also important, but probably slightly less important. There are some links between far-right movements in Europe and even in the US and the Russians. But I would say these are often overestimated and actually tend to it's almost an attempt to say, well, these right-wing populists are actually just people from the outside. They're just financed from internationally, and we shouldn't really care about what they say because they're just all Russian trolls. And I think that's underestimating what is behind that. And I think you've done like a couple of things you mentioned earlier with this sense of like the elites are against us and the sense of there's a crisis of democracy. I think there's also something to be taken quite seriously. And as much as we talk negatively about right-wing populism or authoritative populism, I think it's important to recognize that in many ways they have realized that there is a crisis of identity, that there is a crisis of democracy, that there is a crisis of recognition of this tension between liberalism, technocracy, and democracy. And they are giving voice to a problem. I think their remedies are quite dangerous and actually just replicating and mirroring what has led to the problem on the left in the first place. But I still think it's important that we recognize that and not just say like, oh, these are just foreign agents going into that. But I do think that the Russian way is important as an inspiration for this much more relativist rather than universalist idea of identity and what human community is about.
I think that's a really interesting observation of that, the issue of universalism being the crucial dividing line. I did notice the effect that Putin has had that there was this weird moment roughly in 2016 where I saw people on the right in America, their attitudes towards Russia and towards Putin changing. And as someone who grew up in the Cold War, the idea that the Republican Party would be the more pro-Russia party, it really sort of caught me unaware. It was unexpected. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But there was this sense of change of flipping the attitudes towards Russia because it was seen as a model of, well, he's standing up for his civilization, for their traditional civilization, and for traditional religion. And the sense of the non-universal aspects of society feeling that they're beleaguered and that they want to reject universal ideas and impose themselves in this sort of populist authoritarian way. So I guess the big question to leave with then is what do you see as what can be done about it? Because there's a sense that there's this new, like I said, I grew up in the Cold War, so there was a sense that you knew where the dividing lines were. It was, the capitalist countries versus the communist countries. And now there's a sense that, well, wait a minute, it's actually, the liberal democracies versus the authoritarian versus an authoritarian model, really. What can be done about that in terms of strengthening the defenses and the foundations of what we call liberal democracy?
Yeah, I mean, if I had a golden cure, like some silver bullet, I probably wouldn't be some minor researcher being very poorly paid anymore. But I do think that this is really the key question to think about in the future, and I think the temptation often is, and that is what we are doing. If we look at our contemporary politics, we see right-wing authoritarian identity politics and populism. And what do we respond with? We respond with left-wing identity politics and say these people shouldn't be here in the first place, and it's all about whiteness, and it's all about that. And the problem is these rhetorics are on the same playing field. They're on the same, they define politics in the same way, in a way, by the color of one's skin or by one's origins or things that you cannot change. And in a way, we have moved away from conflicts about like bread and butter conflicts about economics, about wages, about taxes, and all of these like really bread and butter issues that actually change people's lives, to these red meat issues that are only about who I am, who are you, who belongs, who doesn't. And I think the only way to stop this vicious circle of right-wing populist identity politics strengthening left-wing woke identity politics is to start saying that's not the real problems. Let's actually focus on the problems we have, and first of all try to dissociate identity from politics. And I think that is a big problem we have, that actually that, and our common friend Jonathan Rauch has just written about that, how nowadays party and politics is a main source of your identity. And I think that's highly problematic, because you can disagree with somebody about what they think about X and Y, but you cannot disagree with somebody about who they are. And I think this step to say, dissociate the opinion from the person and go back to old school liberalism of saying, this is not your identity. What you believe on issue X, Y, and Z is not your identity. It's, you can take a position and you can change your position. And actually, you should change your position if you lose an argument. The good John Stuart Mill approach of like, you almost want to be contradicted and you want to be in a debate, because it's not about who you are, but it's about what the idea that there is a right and a wrong, and it's not my right and my truth and your right and your truth. And then we can't reconcile those. So we basically have to fight each other, but to say like, no, we are both trying to get an approximate of the truth and we disagree about that. But in the end, through disagreement, we might get a bit closer. So I think moving away from the identity politics and moving towards issues, bread and butter rather than red meat.
Bread and butter rather than red meat. I like that. And I also think below that, the issue, the specific issues, also talking about the ideas. I mean, I mentioned earlier, Socrates I view as the beginning of the distinctive Western approach, because his whole approach was, let's get together, have a discussion, let's debate all the ideas and try to come, by discussing them, try to come to some universal truth. That's one of the reasons I call what I'm doing symposium, because symposium was just a drinking party until Socrates came along and he went to one and Plato writes it down, and it becomes synonymous with people getting together and having a discussion and trying to draw out a universal truth from that discussion. And I think that's really, the fundamental answer to getting back to this sort of universalism as opposed to the tribalism of on both sides is this idea of just going back and having people talk this out and debate amongst each other and talk about ideas. And that's one of the reasons I'm glad I got you to come along here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wouldn't underestimate the importance of socializing, like of just having, and I think that's a big problem. Like we don't have friends in different political camps anymore. And if we had, it would be much better, because you would learn to laugh about it and also realize that just because somebody politically disagrees doesn't mean that he's a bad or good person necessarily. And that is probably also my biggest takeaway from all of I've done about 145 interviews with right-wing populist leaders, left-wing leaders, faith leaders, etc. And probably the best thing was just like being forced to listen to everybody for the first half an hour and not being able to contradict actually is really helpful to understand where people are coming from. And you realize, actually, yes, we disagree about this like 20%, but on the bottom, we can actually agree about much, much more. And I think if people only talk for long enough and don't just go in a bullfight, they would actually realize that. And so I'm still optimistic in the end.
As am I. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing this outlook and the information you've gained.
Yeah, my pleasure. Absolutely. I really enjoyed the discussion.
My guest today has been Tobias Cremer, researcher at Oxford University and an expert on populist authoritarianism, the very topical discussion for today. This has been Symposium. You can find more ideas and more discussion like this by following our YouTube channel and also by going to symposium.substack.com. Thank you for joining the conversation.